Good evening. Very pleased that you're all here. I'm Linus Mattauch. I'm an environmental economist at the Technical University of Berlin and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, although I'm speaking from Oxford tonight. I've been a member of the Junge Academie, Germany since 2021, which, as most of you know, it's the first in the international scene of its kind as an interdisciplinary organization for early career researchers to provide a collective forum, which was funded in 2000 by its sponsoring learned societies, the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Science and the National Academy of Science Leopoldina. So for a period of 5 years, us members got a creative and experimental space here to do projects together. So we're encouraged to have discussions to stimulate social dialogue. So what you'll see this evening is an example of that. Today's climate lecture is then the 11th since the inception of this in 2019. It's very special because for the first time, we're trying out a format that's pan-European. So we're joined by colleagues from the Young Academy of Ireland, the Young Academy of Italy, the Young Academy of Sweden, and the Global Young Academy. And so together we want to try and have an opportunity to provide a diversity of academic views across largely the social and a bit of natural science on the future of climate policy making at the European level. So, or in other words, I have a very brief intro for you, although I'm moderating the discussion largely. What is then the future for European climate policy as we see it in 2025 this summer? So just as a reminder to set the scene for the presentations, you can see that for the agreed target for 2030, which is quite short term in politics, the EU will roughly halve their greenhouse gas emissions from 1990. Why is the EU there at all? Well, because environmental and climate policy is shared competency between the European Union and its member states, which is to say the European Union, the European level, provides at least a base case for which the member state have to follow. And then it's also agreed that in 2050, the continent's meant to reach net zero, which is broadly in line with, broadly speaking, with the Paris Agreement. That would lead to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, at least if other countries follow. And so while the 2030 target, you could say, again, sort of on a broad perspective, will be reached, the debate this summer at the European level is the proposal for the 2040 target, where the European Commission, after scientific policy advice, is expected to put forward a minus 90% target. We'll hear more about that later. And then negotiations at the European level to continue into autumn in all likelihood. So that's the background where the European climate policy, at least on the mitigation and decarbonization, currently stands. And against this background, tonight, we're sort of wondering about the following questions. So first, why is this ambitious target needed? But also, what are the institutional constraints for climate policy at the European level? What's the role of corporate sustainability? Which challenges does populism pose? What are constraints and opportunities of EU decarbonization at the national level? So here we take perhaps not the countries that might come first to mind, but we go for Austria and Ireland as examples. And by which policy instruments, time permitting, can the EU achieve this target? Now, that's a way too broad set of question and topic for a single person to be invited. So I'm very glad I'm joined, and this is the first time we try this, by a European group of speakers at a similar career level across institutions and academies. We're very fortunate to have with Claudia Keller, a policymaker from the European Commission with us. And then we have Peter representing the Swedish Young Academy, Carlotta representing the Italian Young Academy. Hermine in Graz is on the ticket of the Junge Akademie too, because it's German speaking, not only Germany. We have Niall joining from Ireland, and we have Théo Konc from Wageningen as an expert on populism on the panel. That's the panel. And so that's already my introduction. I stop screen sharing here and will introduce the first speaker, who is Peter Søgaard Jørgensen from the Young Academy of Sweden at Stockholm University too, where he leads a group on evolution and sustainability and is a research group leader, including also at the Stockholm Resilience Center. Peter, we're very fortunate to have you. I should perhaps just remind also the people who were here a little bit later, we'll have now the contributions from the 6 speakers, and we'll have a general discussion at the end. So thanks very much, and Peter, looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Linus. Very excited to be here and to be sharing, having this discussion with everyone. I'm going to be speaking briefly about the EU decarbonization in the context of polycrisis. And I'm not sure how much of a natural science perspective I will be bringing, but at least an interdisciplinary sustainability science perspective. And of course, it's when we're talking about EU decarbonization and polycrisis, it's difficult not to go back to the years of 2015, 2016, when actually the chief commissioner of the EU really helped popularize this term of polycrisis when the EU was facing issues with migration. There was still the EU debt crisis and several other things. Junge called it the worst economic, financial, and social crisis since World War II. That was in 2016. In 2018, according to this quote here, he felt it was not so long ago that the Union was in danger of sleepwalking from one crisis to another without waking up. But we have since then slowly but surely turned the page from this so-called polycrisis. So that was 2018. I don't have to remind everyone here what happened the year after in terms of the COVID pandemic, and then in the wake of the COVID pandemic, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And these two events have really elevated and helped galvanize actually research on the polycrisis. I should say, as a basis for all of this, I will take that everyone is aware about the importance of rapid decarbonization to stay below 2 degrees, and more importantly, also try and come as quickly below 1.5 degrees again, both to avoid harm on the most vulnerable people to climate change, but also to minimize the risk of triggering or destabilizing Earth system tipping points. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but I will be talking about the context of the polycrisis, which we're seeing now manifesting in multiple ways. So we actually crunched the numbers here. So as scientists, we want to know, well, is the EU really in a polycrisis? And when we have built this global database for multiple shocks, and here I'm showing a figure of climate, conflict, economic, food production, and infectious disease shocks across multiple regions in the world. If you follow the dark green line, that's the OECD countries, of which the EU make up a significant part. And you're basically seeing here the frequency with which these 5 shocks co-occur, the proportion of these shocks co-occurring. And you can see that since 2010, for the OECD countries, we have been at a very high level of elevated co-occurrence of these crises. So yeah, there's no wonder that Junge actually felt he was in a polycrisis. We can now show with data that at least looking at these 5 shocks, the EU has been in some kind of polycrisis of multiple co-occurring shocks since 2010. So why is this happening? And can we make sense of these dynamics to anticipate both the pushbacks to rapid decarbonization, but also the opportunities and leverage points? That's what I want to try and talk to you about today. I will mainly be basing the next few slides on this article from last year called The Evolution of the Polycrisis, and which introduces the concept of Anthropocene traps. And actually, this cycle here, of which growing social complexity have been these are the system dynamics underlying growing social complexity throughout the Anthropocene, throughout deep history and more recent history. And I'm not going to have time to go into detail with this, but want to briefly show you how we should not be surprised that these 5 crises I just showed you before are now co-occurring, because they're actually all products of this cycle. When this cycle comes to you could say the global limit, which we can say is the past 70 years of unprecedented global cooperation, human cultural evolutionary dynamics actually change fundamentally. And so instead of, as products of unprecedented limits of cooperation and connectivity, we are vulnerable to pandemics. Increasing levels of specialization of, for example, food systems make our food systems fragile to shocks. The continued focus on growth and unsustainable models of growth leads to increasing risk of economic crisis. We're all here talking about climate today. I don't have to talk about that. And most recently, the big shock is really the altering of the global regime towards a more multipolar world and the new armed conflicts we're seeing as a result of that. So we shouldn't be surprised, and we can actually use fundamental systems dynamics based on the Anthropocene to anticipate some of this polycrisis and the pushbacks. In the paper, we highlight not only one system dynamic, but actually 4 factors that we should be taking into account if we want to anticipate polycrisis. So I talked about hitting the limits of the planet, as we call it here. The others are the multiple sides of technology, the accelerating pace of change, and feedbacks to globalization. This is going to be very cursory when I go over them right now in the interest of time, but please ask questions later if you have them. So I'll start with technology. And also I will highlight some leverage points, so it's not all doom and gloom, but actually what are some of the leverage points from understanding these dynamics. So the multiple sides of technology, I think some of the risks to rapid decarbonization we're seeing from that is the technology optimism. So we're seeing a lot of countries wanting to wait for a technological breakthrough. And some countries even call this is the other hockey stick. They're waiting for some technology to come to maturity so we can rapidly decarbonize. Another is related to information overflow stemming from social media and AI facilitating the spread of mis and disinformation. I think a leverage point from these dynamics are going back to understanding how we can scale nature-based solutions, these solutions that we already have. In terms of the increasing pace of change, what happens when we're seeing these increasing shocks and frequency of shocks is there's a risk of forcing short-term policy horizons, which might also be a risk of to this 2040 goal. So that's a risk, but I think point is that we know some of the biggest business will businesses to reconsider. So I think from a lot of their perspective and their communication, they're actually looking for clear pathway. So that's a leverage point. And in the last one, we'll talk about the increasing social backlash from vulnerable demographics to globalization and decarbonization. And that we should anticipate to continue. But I think when we're thinking about globalization, the EU could also leverage this power as a trading bloc to drive not only domestic rapid decarbonization, which is where we may be really seeing the pushback to, but also decarbonization of consumptive footprints. So that's the emissions that are not happening in the territory of the EU, but abroad, and that will help maybe scale the decarbonization. So I think that's all the time I have, but I think what I want you to take away from this talk is briefly that we can use an understanding of the polycrisis and the underlying dynamics generating it to nurture capacities to rapidly decarbonize in a polycrisis world. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the succinct presentation and setting the scene. As mentioned to those who came a little bit later, there'll be questions across all speakers from the audience at the end. So we continue now. We're fortunate to have Claudia Keller with us, who studied political science and history and worked for the German Ministry of the Environment, but joined recently the European Commission as at least sort of I read, as a strategic coordinator around the questions we're discussing today. So, and as the old joke goes, the policymaker appears without slides while the academics all bring their slides. So Claudia, looking forward to your input without slides then. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Linus, and great to join you for a second time. And of course, this exchange with science is always very appreciated. Yeah, just a brief word. So Claudia and 10 years of climate policy experience in initially Germany and so domestic and European, and now here in Brussels for quite an exciting time, I would say. At the beginning of a new mandate of the Commission, and with a lot of interest, of course, for the next 10 years of climate policy to be decided hopefully very soon. So basically, I thought of structuring my intervention through what we do in my work. So I work in DG Klima, of course, that leads the climate policy files in the European Union. And basically, we do 4 things in my unit that is relevant for the topic of the seminar today, which is the future of the European climate policy. So first of all, the climate law is in our drawer, so to say. So we initially wrote it and designed it and set in stone the 2030 target and the climate neutrality in 2050. And as you know, we will also be proposing soon the 2040 target, and we will then negotiate it with the institutions. So in that sense, it's great that we're also entertaining the relations with the institutions in Europe, so namely the European Council and the European Parliament, the European climate law, and the 2040 target as part of it will be negotiated in a co-legislative process. And that, of course, means that we both have to have an agreement with the Council and the 27 member states and the Parliament. And of course, the European Commission is constantly in a policy dialogue with the member states and with science. We had the impact assessment published last year, but we are, of course, talking constantly through the European Parliament and member states on their views of the 2040 targets. And then finally, what we also do in my unit is infringements. So we will take member states eventually to court if they do not comply with the existing EU legislation. And you might all know very well that we come out of a very impressive policy cycle where we established a very wide-ranging range of instruments. And we notably observe the implementation of the extension of the emission trading system to aviation and maritime, and as well as the emission trading systems for mobility and the building sector. And with that in the background, how does that translate in a sense to the negotiation and the setting of a new climate target? Well, basically, everything is new. We have a new mandate of the Commission, which is very different than the previous ones, and you are all very familiar with climate policy. So you might, of course, know that initially the impact assessment was done a year ago, and it did look, of course, very comprehensively at the benefits of this long-term climate policy, and as such, was included in the consideration of the new mandate of the Commission. So you will find in the, let's say, homework or the mission letters, they are called, that the proposal of the 90% target in 2040 is in several of the homework, so to say, both of the president of the Commission and the responsible commissioners. But the polycrisis that we've heard about before, and the different economic environment and also the state of the European integration in the sense played into it. So there was a latter report that was important for finalizing the European internal market, and of course leveraging the power and size that we do have, and particularly in relation to energy, the energy market, and making sure that we build out renewables, but that also this energy can flow within the EU. And that, of course, and we had the Draghi report, of course, that sets out how the EU can sustain its sustainable economic growth model in a multifaceted and challenging world. And all those three things in a sense were reflected both in the overall new mandate of the Commission and of course in the institutional setup. And if you know a bit, you know that we do have a very experienced climate policy maker responsible for competition policy. So there will be a very interesting new approach to how competition policy can also work hand in hand with climate policy. And she's a social democrat, Teresa Ribeira. But she does have, and we don't have the Timmermans anymore, who was a vice president. So in a sense, we do have two major players, which is competition policy and industry policy, the French commissioner, and both of them manage and coordinate the work of climate and energy and environmental policy. So new mandate, new composition. Second one, a council that is more dominated by center-right. So the council might seem, of course, as this one institution that has to have a position on policy fields, but it's, of course, continuously influenced by the elections taking place, and then within member states, how climate policy features as part of these elections. And most notably, we will have the Polish elections, which have been instrumental in a sense how the Polish presidency did approach the dealing of policy, of climate policy. And we will have the French elections very soon upcoming. And we had the German elections where, of course, Brussels looked very closely at how the German coalition agreement kind of formulated their position on the 2040 target. And then the same applies to the European Parliament. The European Parliament, you might know very well, had elections a year ago, and there were major wins for the right and right-wing parties, and kind of again also a more strong European people, so center-right parties. And that means overall that both the narrative and the constellation within the European Parliament and the Council will be more challenging for climate policy, and it is our task to work with those new realities. It's not a challenge, it's just a new reality that we have to deal with. And then taking kind of the angle of infringements that I was talking about, a major issue of member states is the understanding of where we stand with the existing climate policy, and if we have if we are kind of convinced enough that the policies that we do have in place will lead us to already a very working and functioning decarbonization pathway that allows, of course, growth at the same time. And maybe to end today with maybe not a kind of positive note, the Financial Times has been leaking today that the Commission will be publishing very soon, and this is why I can say that today, an assessment of member states' climate and energy plans. And it doesn't look too grim. So we are actually, based on what member states have been providing us, of course, with their projections, we are almost at a pathway of achieving the 2030 target. That looks really good. But in the negotiations of the 2040 targets, we will, of course, look at the challenges that have been existing with member states. And to finish for today, those challenges will, of course, feature in the negotiations between the European Parliament and the Council. And maybe just to name a few challenges, it will, of course, depend, or it will be important to have flexibilities within the instruments that we already have in place. This is something that we do hear quite often from the European Parliament and the Council. And then the kind of financial support, both for the decarbonization at home and by citizens, but also for the industry, will of course play a very important role. And then the increasing readiness of the European Union to incentivize and use negative emission technologies. And maybe the last issue will, of course, be the increasing coherence of member states' climate policy versus an existing differentiation between member states. But to end with a positive note today, that it doesn't look too grim, and I'm very hopeful and hopeful that we will manage to agree on something that is good, and this is the starting point for the development of a very comprehensive policy field, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. And I'm grateful you two pick up very different parts of reality, which are equally true. So we'll discuss this later. The next contribution, now zoom in and discuss an angle of the entire question of the future of the climate policy more closely. So next we have Carlotta Rinaldo from the Young Academy of Italy in the University of Padua, who is an associate professor in law and will bring in a perspective on law and corporations, I understand. Thank you very much for being here.
Yes, well, thank you so much. It is really a pleasure to talk about this event, and I'm very thankful to Claudia because she gave me the background of the topic I will be talking about, because just the change that she told us that has been happening in the last year has had a specific impact on the topic I will be talking about. So my topic is Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and how there was, I can now say there was a trend in European law in shifting from soft law disclosure to hard law disclosure, due diligence obligations across global value chains. So why does corporate sustainability matter? Why should companies along the value chain consider sustainability goals and ESG values across different their global value chains, so going throughout the whole globe? Why should European companies have to worry about what happens in their global value chain? The question is a fundamental one, and traditionally, as I said, there used to be a soft law disclosures, so guiding principles on businesses and human rights. As you can see, this is the UN Human Rights Network or the OECD guidelines. So the idea was that companies were only supposed to you all know that companies are no longer isolated and self-sufficient entities. They operate as huge constellations that bring out global value chains that go throughout the whole world. And the idea was that this interconnectedness should not only bring profits to European companies, it should also bring shared responsibilities, and companies should ensure that ESG values, and especially environmental and human rights standards, should be upheld not only where European law directly applies, but also throughout their supply chains. Traditionally, as I said, it was only considered to be a reputational advantage to say what companies do throughout their value chain. So on a voluntary basis, there was disclosure with, of course, all the problems that soft law provides in disclosure. So what happens is that if there is an infringement? What happens if a company does not do what it discloses? So soft law disclosure in the long term seemed insufficient, and some national laws followed suit, requiring companies to report risks. The shift, which I think was important, was moving from considering requiring companies to report to requiring companies to act on these on the awareness that they had, because awareness did not always lead to action. So the focus slowly changed towards mandatory due diligence, requiring companies to identify, prevent, and mitigate harm actively. First came the French Loi de Vigilance in 2017, which you cannot see very well right now, but then came the German framework on a duty of diligence in 2021, which I hear is now in the Koalitionsvertrag going to be changed, but We'll see what happens. And then after a long negotiation, the directive of 2024 was implemented. So we now have due diligence directive applying only to large companies, and it was originally very ambitious, so including full value chains, both up and downstream, and it identified what large companies should identify, monitor, and prevent, especially in terms of environmental questions and human rights protection. Since we're now talking about climate change, I would like to point out Article 22, because Article 22 of the directive specifically was specifically dedicated to combating climate change. So companies, big companies, as I said, very big companies after the directive was finally approved, companies had a specific obligation to adopt and implement a climate transition plan aimed at aligning their business model and strategy with the objectives of the Paris Agreement and European climate law. Companies must ensure that their operations contribute, you can see it, it was clearly stated in this article, towards a sustainable economy and to the limitation of global warming to 1.5 degrees, in line with the EU's climate neutrality goal by 2050. And the plan it must include very specific information. Why am I kind of switching from is to was, and why am I saying that this trend, which I think was very useful because it meant that European laws did not only matter in Europe, but they mattered also throughout value chains which can be happening worldwide, both upstream and downstream. Also, just think of the product disposal, which is very important in terms of environmental problems. Why am I saying this? Because just as we said, this year, last year, well, it all started last year, but there was a clear change in the political environment. And the council gave a green light on the Stop the Clock directive, which was approved on April 14th, 2025. What did the Stop the Clock directive do? This directive postponed the implementation deadline of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which we just looked at, as well as the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive by 1 and 2 years. So member states have a longer time to implement these rules. And in the meantime, I hope you can see it in this screenshot from the European Parliament. In the meantime, in this Omnibus 1 packet, there has been there is a specific idea of renegotiating this directive. And what we hear from the Academy, and we just hear it, but I think it is going to happen, that what we hear is that the goals we have seen, the ideas behind the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive are going to go in a completely new direction now. Of course, with the new political environment, there is a stop, and we have to see what is going to happen next. But this omnibus package includes a directing that is directly going to change the content and the scope of the sustainability reporting and the due diligence requirement. It will have to go via co-decision, so we're going to have quite some time before we see what happens. But I think that even if there were clearly some criticisms that could be made to the directive from a corporate lawyer point of view, because we could not, I was very skeptical myself, but it was a first step in the direction of resilience, transparency, long-term value. There were some obligations which might not have been as clear as we think, but and there was surely a problem of the conflict between the different stakeholder interests. We will now have to wait if the trend I was showing, moving from soft law to hard law, from disclosure to due diligence, and expanding this due diligence worldwide, is seriously going to stop, or if it's just going to change ways. We'll see what happens next. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carlotta, for the highly instructive presentation. You really get a panorama tonight of different angles on the problem. So I'm very grateful. My colleague Théo Konc is joining from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, where he's an assistant professor in environmental economics, as he's sort of turning into the new expert on the interaction of populism with setting environmental policy, or how environmental policy might lead to new waves of populism. Théo, looking forward to what you have to tell us about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides. So yeah, I'm very happy to talk to you today. And yeah, when Linus asked me to say something about climate policy and populism, I was like, okay, that's very complicated. You basically asked me to talk about the combination, the crossroad of two of the major challenges that we have nowadays: climate policy, right? Trying to manage climate damages to reduce carbon emissions, and the rise of populism. So when you first think about it, and actually the first time I thought about that, yeah, I felt that these were different issues. We want to do different things. Those are different problems. Climate policy, again, is about trying to reduce climate change, reduce climate damages, and the rise of populism, well, it is the rise of authoritarian leaders that have a stark nationalistic, let's say, angle in their policies. So by the end of this talk, what I really want to convey is that actually there is a link between these two challenges, between climate policy and populism. And even more important, I want to convey that this link is actually could be very problematic for the future of European climate policies. And I will try to give some solutions on some avenue for maybe a future discussion. So let me start by showing you the three different links that I can think exist between climate and populism. So these links, I call them assumptions, because we don't know, right? This is something that might come from some empirical literature, from theoretical literature, but this is vastly speculations. Now we don't know for sure this is happening, but let's take them as assumptions. So the first assumption that we have, the first link that we can imagine between climate and populism, it is that when in power, populists will oppose stringent climate policies. So there is evidence for that. So here I put you a reference if you want to look at it. But the idea is very simple, and I think will surprise nobody. Just look at what Donald Trump is doing in the US, and you have the picture. So the first link is when in power, populists tend to oppose climate policies. The second link, that is already a bit more complicated, is that damages that we will experience because of climate change could also increase support for populists. Why is that? Well, damages from climate change are basically shock that people will have to pay. So you shock people, you destroy, their house is destroyed, their livelihood is endangered. They lose their job because of a flood or because of something else. So there are some papers in the literature, so here I also point you to one, that basically show that, well, certain people that are exposed to negative environmental shock, so to floods, for instance, that tend to increase their support for populist parties. So here the example is for Italy. So not only we have the first link that populist party in power might oppose stringent climate policy, we also have the second link, that climate damages might also increase support for populists in the future. And then we have the third link, that's more linked to my own research, is that climate policies in themselves could also increase support for populists. Again, why is that? Well, when we implement stringent climate policy, what do? We increase, for instance, the cost of energy. We increase maybe the vulnerability of people that are then prone to turn to populist leaders, to turn to especially far-right populist parties. And so again, here in the literature, there's this idea that climate policies could lead to a backlash. People rejecting them because they lead to high cost, and people that face high cost from climate policy might support populists. So here I just try to convey that there's three links between climate and populism. And so what does that mean? What does that mean for the future of European climate policy? And now I will stop talking about the literature and we just try to share my thoughts and what do I see, what are the implications I see from these three assumptions. So I will guide you through three different scenarios, three different possibilities I see for European climate policy. So scenario one. So again, this is made up graphs. It just shows you the dynamics, like the numbers mean nothing. So imagine all what I said before is correct. Populists in power oppose climate policy, climate damages, increase support for populists, and climate policies also increase for populists. Then what could we observe? Well, here I show you on the red graph. So imagine we increase climate policy stringency, which was the dynamic that just Carlotta conveyed. Okay, we want to have more hard instruments. We want to increase maybe carbon taxes overall. Well, what we might expect happening at the same time? Well, as I said, as we have more climate policies, well, populists might pick up on it. And people might start to support more populist politicians. What will be the reaction? Well, as populists get close to power or gain political leverage and weight, well, we might see a backlash, right? So climate policy decreasing. If all the assumptions are correct, the equilibrium, the long-term dynamic should be climate populists in power, maintenance of power because of climate change, and policy stringency going to zero. But again, this is the worst case scenario. Okay, this is a scenario where climate policies are basically fueling populism and climate change is also fueling populism. Now we can challenge some of these assumptions. So my second scenario, now the graph looks a bit more complicated, but I will get you through it. Now imagine that, as it's shown by other papers in the literature, that actually damages from climate change do not increase support for populists, but decrease support for populists. What is the idea? Well, I am exposed to a flood, when I'm exposed to an extreme climate event. What do? Well, I realize, hey, maybe we should do more climate policy. We should try to avoid that in the future. So I will support parties that are pro-environmental, pro-climate policy. Yeah, so that's another possibility. The literature is unclear on what is the right one. So if this is the case, if as we experience more climate change, people will turn to pro-environmental parties, so away from populist parties, this is the kind of dynamics we could imagine. So again, in the first phase, you will have the same thing. We increase climate policy, there is a backlash, this decreased climate policy urgency. But of course, over time, not fighting climate change is going to lead to climate damages. Yeah. So after a while, the idea will be, okay, we have this phase where we have high climate change, high populists. But the hope is that after a while, people will realize, hey, we need more climate policy to avoid all this high cost. And then we will have the reversing dynamic where climate policy would increase and support for populists would decrease. So why is it important? Well, if we manage to convey that to avoid climate costs, we need to have climate policy, then we might try to break this doom scenario. Now let me walk you through the last scenario. So let's say now that we're actually able to implement climate policies that do not increase support for populists. So let's say we do smart politics, smart climate policies. We are able to change people's behavior to reduce carbon emission without increasing discontent, without having this backlash. Well, then we might very well enjoy an increasing amount of climate policy while keeping populists low at bay. Okay, here I'm not saying that populism is only fueled by climate policy. I'm just trying to isolate what could be the marginal effect of climate policy on that. So after I say all this, I want to maybe get 2 points, 2 important points for European climate policy and populism. So the first point that is very important is, of course, we try to make sure that climate policy do not fuel populists. How do we do that? Again, well, by doing smart compensation, by being more transparent in the way we make our policies. So basically, to try to diffuse this elite versus people dichotomy. So this is the first thing we could do. The second thing is to communicate again clearly that climate damages are, one, due to political inaction, and two, this political inaction is largely fueled by, again, populist parties or right parties that oppose climate inaction. So if we make clear that when we have this adverse cost, when we have this flood, when we have this period of drought, this is linked to climate inaction, then we can also hope to break down the issue of climate change and populism. So I hope I try to be brief and short. So that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Théo, for the exceptionally clear presentation. Very much enjoyed that. There's a lot of action in this webinar, so we'll now change the context again, and the final two panelists will each sort of say something about how this comes together for their own country. So we deliberately choose countries that are not so much in the spotlight sometimes of the EU central discussion, which are Austria and Ireland. So I'm glad we have Hermine Mitte here, who is my colleague at the Junge Academie, which is German speaking, not only Germany, so we also have Austrians, and is now a professor for sustainability, climate change, and human behavior at University of Graz. So Hermine, glad to have you. Do take your time. And there we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the introduction. So I hope that you see the presentation. Thank you. As you may know, the former Austrian government had committed itself to achieving the climate neutrality target by 2040. This is, of course, well in line with the EU emission target. And it also implies that all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are balanced by respective sinks. This commitment of the former government was our starting point for the Net Zero 2040 project, which is shown on this slide. And our main aim was to provide an internally consistent and openly accessible set of scenarios attaining full decarbonization of the energy system and supported by a group of stakeholders representing the interests of diverse actors in the energy and mobility sectors. What I have to note here is that we have a new government now, and it still remains unclear whether they really will support this target further. This graph shows you the emission reduction pathway that we followed in the Net Zero 2040 project. It builds on a greenhouse gas emission budget approach consistent with the Paris Agreement. And it was a crucial reference point throughout the whole scenario development process, meaning that we have different scenarios developed for the climate neutrality target, which all share this emission reduction pathway, but they differ in the variation in final energy demand and import shares of energy carriers. So what do the quantitative model results look like? And that's a dense slide, I know, but I have summarized the most important impacts for you. So most importantly, the 4 different scenarios that we investigated, they all show common trends, but different magnitudes of change for almost all indicators that we have investigated. Oh, sorry for that. More clearly, I have 5 key messages for you. If you look at the very first graph of this big picture, we see that all scenarios show a common trend of falling gross domestic energy consumption. And the main reason for that is that we have electrification, both in the mobility sector and in the heating sector. And additionally, we have demand-side measures such as reduced mobility, decreases in heated area, and diminished industrial activity that would decrease gross domestic energy consumption. The second key message I would like to share is related to the second small graph here, and it's about the total cumulative sequestered CO2 in the period 2020 to 2040. And in the scenario with highest sequestration levels, it amounts to about 10% of current Austrian annual emissions. So this is comparably moderate. The third key message is that the structure of the energy system is modified fundamentally in all four scenarios, as indicated in the second and in the third row of this graph. And what we see here is a consistent common technological shift in energy supply until 2030, which is observed in all scenarios. This implies a rapid expansion of renewable power generation. That's not surprising. And it's also coupled with the electrification and of mobility and heating, and an associated decline of fossil fuels. If we look beyond 2030, the scenarios diverge in terms of the development of the energy supply structure. Generally, what you can see here is that in the low import scenarios shown in green and yellow, there is a greater reliance on domestic biomass and waste and ambient heat. The next key message, so the fourth key message, is related to fossil fuels. So fossil fuel consumption is almost completely phased out in all scenarios. The remaining use of fossil fuels can be explained by lock-in effects of heating systems, which will become carbon neutral only after 2040 due to legacy effects. And the fifth and final key message I have here for you today is that the pace of change in the energy system required to meet climate neutrality in Austria is really, really fast. So it's unprecedented, both for solar PV and wind power. This expansion must be at a faster absolute pace than was historically observed for hydropower, wind, or gas power. And if you want to dig deeper into these scenarios, I would like to invite you to test the Net Zero 2040 Scenario Explorer provided by IASA. So I think I have a few minutes left. What are the drivers? What can be considered drivers and barriers of decarbonization? With respect to drivers, I would like to highlight the innovative technology and the massive cost declines of renewables and low carbon technologies. And also I would like to remind us that the integration costs could be substantial in the future. Drivers, the political agenda globally could be a driver, but it's of course related to Austria a bit uncertain. And the geopolitical situation, if we think about the increase in security of supply, which is a major concern today, this could be also a driver. With respect to barriers, bottlenecks in supply of equipment and also of skilled labor, but also we see barriers in the efficiency and coordination of municipal, state and federal administrations, and also in administrative and infrastructure expansion. With respect to acceptance and just transition, decarbonization is related to shift in benefits and costs in terms of jobs, incomes, landscape quality, etc. So that's also may also be a barrier for policy making. I think I've already raised this. And last but not least, lock-in effects may be barriers because we know investment decisions today are very relevant in terms of reaching the net zero target. To conclude, the good news is that reaching net zero emissions in the Austrian energy systems is economically and technically feasible. However, past trends of the transition are only partly sufficient to reach the climate neutrality target, and clearly the commitment of all societal actors is necessary to reach the climate neutrality target by 2040. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Hermine for the extremely comprehensive and still succinct presentation, showing the basics of what that would mean, such a target for an example European country. Now I'm looking forward to hearing from the last panelist, who's my colleague and friend, Niall Farrell, in the Young Academy of Ireland at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin, where he's Associate Research Professor coordinating the energy and environmental research areas. I'm interested to see how Niall might say the same with different opportunities or constraints for Ireland. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Linus. Thank everybody for the opportunity to speak. So as Linus, as you said, I'll give some insight into climate targets in an Irish context, and perhaps in terms of just a quick snapshot, I can give you just some insight into broad trends in terms of emissions in Ireland and what that might mean in terms of if we're at a crossroads of establishing new targets and how that might be received in an Irish context. And then I'll delve deeper into a few sectors and just give some insights into maybe some of the constraints that are being faced in an Irish context when it comes to delivering on stated on the policy ambitions. And maybe there might be some insight there that might be useful for other member states and other participants here. So from an Irish experience, when it comes to ambitious climate targets, we're not shy about embracing ambitious targets. I suppose the EU target for non-ETS for Ireland is minus 42% reduction, and in Ireland's recent climate action plan has put in place a 51% reduction by 2030, which is inclusive of land use change and forestry changes. This is quite ambitious, and I'll tell you a bit more about where we are at that. But not only that, but we're also coming from a very difficult baseline when it comes to land use change. In recent years, we've actually had our land emissions from that sector increasing because of this cycle when it comes to commercial forestry. It's now time for harvesting commercial forests, and also the fact that science has changed when it comes to emissions that coming from forestry, especially associated with peatland. So this is something which is very, very tricky, but also has been incorporated into recent policy, even despite these sort of changes. The Irish Environmental Protection Agency has sort of projected what our emissions will look like from now until 2030. So if you look at this graph here, the grey line sort of says where we need to be in terms of our rate of emissions to reach our targets. And then we have our dotted lines which sort of say, well, if we take advantage of all the flexibilities available, this is the adjustment that one would make. The orange line tells you where we would be given the policies that have been put in place and if we deliver on those policies. And then the blue line tells you the policies that have been put in place plus additional measures that are not necessarily in place yet, but are somewhere in the pipeline. You can see here, even if in the most optimistic scenario, assuming everything has been delivered, we're still a long way off meeting our 2030 targets. So it is quite challenging in an Irish context to meet the various targets that are in place. I think one of the sort of messages here that I take from this is that we do adopt ambitious targets, and there is the sort of a readiness to adopt a target, but then when it comes to actually delivering on that and having the policies in place, that can be quite difficult. And then furthermore, when you consider those individual policies that do get over the line, actually achieving those targets can also be quite difficult. So I think that's the first, I suppose, insight that I could offer. Targets are easy, delivery is difficult. I think this is something that's experienced elsewhere. When we dig deeper then into maybe the certain policies that are in place in an Irish context, some have been quite challenging, and we can see maybe there might be some insight here that might be helpful for various different other sectors and other member states. So when we come to buildings, in terms of Ireland has quite a poor housing stock, and one of the targets is to try and increase the energy efficiency of the dwellings in Ireland. And the current target is to upgrade 500,000 dwellings to B2 energy performance certificate rating, or BER rating as is known in Ireland, by 2030. So this is about 12,500 household dwellings by 2030, and in the last few years, or per quarter I should say, has been about 5,000 per quarter. So we're under half what we need to get to our target. Now of course we've had COVID and all these sort of constraints that are there, But essentially, the main constraint that we're faced with is Ireland is performing very well. We have an economy at full employment. We don't have enough people in the construction sector to do the sort of job, the work that's required, and we need to increase the sector quite rapidly to meet these targets. And these constraints are really starting to bite. And there's a bit of work done by myself and colleagues to try and estimate, put a rough figure on what that might be. The number of workers that are required to actually achieve the targets on time are something around 15 to 22,000. These are some government estimates, essentially. To put that into context, that's about 16% of where Ireland was right at the very peak of the construction, or sorry, 16% of construction sector, maybe in 2017, which is the most recent figures. And we need to do that overnight. Very, very difficult to achieve, and not something that can be handled very easily. The lesson I take from this is that there are short-term capacity constraints that we need to consider when we're setting our targets. If I could pick and choose what we're going to do at different times, I would say, well, at this moment in time, we need to import labor as opposed to using our own labor because we don't have it. So maybe you want to front load targets such as renewables because we don't necessarily manufacture things in Ireland, and then maybe think about energy efficiency, backload, those sort of approaches. Easier said than done, of course, and if you want to have that achievable, well, then you need to make sure you have the skills ready in the longer term. Of course, that sort of sorting can happen if you have well-functioning price signals that translate and you don't have other market failures. But of course, you have to make sure that the other market failures are addressed. So it could be behavioral interventions when it comes to maybe making sure you have the right skills available. And if you have subsidies, that can distort these sort of price signal effects, and that could be something you might want to consider as well. Transport is another very tricky one in an Irish context. We have a very distributed population. And I think this goes back many years of poor planning. So a lot of one-off housing in rural areas, we're very much tied to private transport. And electric vehicles have to do a lot more heavy lifting than maybe in other European countries to help us meet our targets in that regard. The target for electric vehicles in Ireland is somewhere at 845,000 by 2030. To get there, again, very ambitious with about 444,000 per year on average. It's what I'm less worried about, but at the same time, the rate of deployment is not at the rate that would need to meet whatever targets are in place. We need accelerated deployment, of course. If we think about ETS too, and maybe bringing transport into carbon pricing, well, that could help maybe on a European level. At an Irish level, we have a domestic carbon tax, so we do have these sort of price signals in place. But I think in a broader circumstance, if we have more stronger price signals at a European level when it comes to transport emissions, maybe that might help with innovation and these sort of developments, and that might have spillover effects in Ireland. So I think it's something to bear in mind also. When it comes to electricity, again, we're back to sort of planning type constraints that we're facing. Ireland performs relatively well when it comes to electricity. It's a very windy country. It's one of the few upsides of being out in the middle of the Atlantic. But our target is to have maybe 80% renewables by 2030. Now the progress so far is 41%, which is still not too bad, but it's still a long way off our target. I think one thing that a lesson to be learned here, and a bit of work that myself and colleagues have looked into, is that we have many systems when it comes to planning and trying to get like these sort of projects off the ground. We have our general planning system, which is to do with building in general, but then you have your grid connection and the system that goes around with that. And up until very recently, and there's still some constraints there, those systems operated in parallel. They still operate in parallel, and if you had a delay in one system, that could offset your application in the other system. And next thing is, a 6-month delay turns into a 2-year delay very easily. There's a bit more opportunities to allow more flexibility with that regard, but there could be better coordination there. And I think this is a good lesson to be learned here. This sort of coordination, it's a win-win all around in that it gets you, it's well for improving from climate perspective, but also from a general economic development perspective, and something which requires a very careful thought. I'll finish then on an opportunity as opposed to a potential opportunity as opposed to a constraint, but still something that where we have a potential constraint. So again, going back to the fact that Ireland is a very windy country, for many years, renewables and associated developments have been seen as maybe perhaps an industrial opportunity. So maybe for the last 10 or 15 years, the development of wind and maybe even offshore has been something that has been considered as something that where we could develop industry in Ireland. A map here shows the island of Ireland, but also then you see the offshore territory that we have, which is many times more of what's actually onshore. So many would say to you that this is the real map of Ireland, and that we see, okay, if we were to take advantage of this with renewables, you could have some sort of considerable industrial capacity. And for many years, that has been considered in the context of renewables, but now it's being considered in the context of green hydrogen. But one piece of work that has been carried out, just a review for the Climate Council in Ireland, was to consider, well, what role of could green hydrogen play in an Irish context? And of course, it's quite expensive, and it can be used maybe for the very, very hard to abate sectors. But one key insight there when it comes to hydrogen, that came out from this piece of work, was that if you were to have cost-effective hydrogen, the electrolyzers to produce the green hydrogen have to be running at quite a high rate, quite a high percentage of the time, and a percentage of the time that's greater than the percentage of the time the wind blows. And that would put Ireland on the back foot in terms of a green hydrogen sort of hub. So in that context, Ireland may struggle to compete with other sources of green hydrogen, and the jury's still out as to whether we could play a role in that regard. The lesson I take from that is essentially decarbonisation can perhaps bring industrial opportunities, but industrial policy should not be leading decarbonisation and green policy in that regard. And I think this is a lesson that Irish policy is perhaps learning the hard way, and maybe something that can be taken on board in other contexts. So just to conclude, then I won't leave you too long. Yeah, so strong political messaging in Irish context. I think political parties across the board are very much in favour of climate ambition and climate targets, and it's not difficult to get the policy targets across the line in Ireland. When it comes to delivering on policies, actually establishing policies and then delivering on those policies, that becomes very, very difficult. And there's perhaps some sort of political disconnect there that we could speculate on as to why that happens. In terms of specific lessons, I think capacity constraints in terms of labour, I think this is something that's common across all European countries, but definitely very much binding in an Irish context. Maybe perhaps need to be considered when setting the various targets. But if you're backloading a certain target, I think it's very important to have the policies in place to make sure you deliver when you need to deliver, and that requires the lead in time. There might be spillover benefits when it comes to transport in an Irish context. And planning processes need to interact with other regulations. That's very important to take into account. And then, of course, industrial policy should not be leading decarbonisation policy. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.